Okay, this is the slideshow for population ecology, which looks at individual populations, one species, one location, and sees how they change over time. We'll look at positive and negative feedback. We'll look at dynamics of the population, how they trend over time, what affects the population growth, what affects how they fluctuate over time, and then other factors important to population ecology. We're going to skip human demographic transition, save that for another lecture. Okay, there's different ways of looking at different species and ecological interactions within an area. Organismal ecology focuses on an organism, maybe like the migration of the humpback whale or the diet of a particular organism. Just focuses on that organism, what it ate, where it went, what it does. Population ecology expands that to all of the individuals of the same species living in the same location. How do they grow in the population? Birth rate, death rate, those sort of factors, such as for this white-footed mouse. What are the factors that affect the white-footed mouse population over time? Community ecology goes one larger. It looks at all the different species located in one particular location. So all of the different types of plants in the tropical rainforest at La Selva Biological Station. Just the living things, not the non-living things. In contrast, ecosystem ecology looks at the interaction between the living things and the non-living things. Bison grazing on the prairie grasses in a short grass prairie, as well as the uptake of nutrients by those things. So it would be the transfer of nutrients from the food to the bison, then the cycling of those nutrients back into the ecosystem that then stimulates more plant growth. It might look at water availability and how that then affects living things, sunlight, air. Landscape ecology, in contrast, looks at different landscape features. The green on this picture shows what we call the riparian zone, trees growing in and around the environment. And so organisms that are migrating through this particular landscape might have to stick to the landscape corridor, then go along the river to get from one place to another. Okay, so from this, we can answer the question, what scale does each of these things examine? Is looking at the birth rate and death rate of species in a location, is that organismal ecology, population ecology, community ecology, ecosystem ecology, or landscape ecology? Well, that would be population, because population looks at birth rate and death rate and how a population changes over time. What are the main food items of a species? Probably I would say that's organismal. What is that organism doing? But it's also the feeding interactions that you see as part of community ecology. So it's a little bit of organismal ecology, a little bit of community ecology. How do different plant species compete for nutrients? Again, this is a little bit of community ecology because it's plant competition, but they're competing for nutrients. That is kind of ecosystem ecology as well. So the categories are not mutually exclusive. How specifically does an organism move in between habitats? Clearly, that's landscape ecology. And then how are nutrients transported between habitats? Maybe by the watershed, maybe by rivers, things like that. That would be ecosystem ecology. So overall, we're looking at things in terms of ecological investigations, scientific investigations that examine the interactions between organisms and the environment, including other organisms. It follows a scientific method. And then from there, our environmental studies or our examination of environmental issues seeks to solve environmental problems using the problem-solving model. So our measurements of the carbon dioxide concentration in ice cores before 1958, and then at Mauna Loa after that, those two correlate really well right around that time period because they're both good measures of this. This would be a scientific measurement initially, but then it can be used if we want to understand climate change and how to maybe address environmental problems within the system. In many ecological systems, we see what's called negative feedback loops, and occasionally we'll see what we call positive feedback loops. So both of these are simplified descriptions of that, just to kind of illustrate what we have here. So first we have a positive feedback loop. This would be where a population then grows by having more births. If you have more births, then you have a bigger population. The bigger population is then capable of having more births, which then raises the population. So each time it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you can have exponential growth within the population. Negative feedback basically opposes the type of change that you have. And your heater is a good example of that. The thermostat controls it around the set point, maybe 69, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If it gets too cold, the heater kicks on and opposes that change to raise the temperature within an area. So heat is produced, the room temperature increases, you go back toward the set point. But then at some point, you might exceed the set point. The thermostat then senses it, kicks the heater off because it's too hot, so no heat's produced, and then the room temperature will decrease, get you back to the set point. So that's negative feedback because it opposes the environmental change. If it's too cold, it warms it up. If it's too hot, it lets it cool off. Now, ecological systems are really a combination of the two of these, primarily these negative feedback loops. So let's kind of track this population. A population that grows then would have more births, that then leads to a larger population, which can lead to more births, as we see in the positive feedback loop at the top. However, that population will have negative effects on its food supply, and then the food supply will decline. That decline in the population then has implications for death rate and birth rate. With a low food supply, you have a higher death rate, so then that's going to decrease the population because there's more deaths within the population. In contrast, if you have an abundant food supply, it has a positive effect on births, which then has a positive effect on the population. So all of these kind of cycle in order to impact given populations. Many populations can increase exponentially, and it might not look like that from this. This is a water hyacinth. The number of plants can increase slowly at first, from 2 to 3 to 4 to 8 to 16. And then if it doubles each time, at some point you get to where there's millions and billions of hyacinth plants covering entire lakes, smothering other organisms below that need light. So this is an invasive and exotic plant that has a tremendous capacity for increased growth or exponential growth. It has a high birth rate within the population. Looking at an individual population, we tend to look at this as factors that increase the population size and factors that can decrease the population size. Birth rate can increase the population size by increasing the population. Immigration, migration in, can also increase the population size. So that would then lead to more song sparrows in this case. In contrast, factors that can decrease that would be predators causing deaths within the population, or emigration, which is then migration out of the population. This then is going to decrease the population size. Over time, the population will follow this trend that we can see on this graph, whereby the population size would grow until it overshoots the carrying capacity known as K, or indicated as K, and then it might die back over time. Population is going to be impacted by biotic potential, its own capacity to increase its population, grow the population, and increase the total size. But this can then overshoot the carrying capacity, leading to environmental resistance. Environmental resistance resists this, especially above the carrying capacity. Organisms run out of food, there's increased predators, increased death, drives the population down. And so over time, the population is going to fluctuate up to maybe over the carrying capacity. Initially, we see exponential growth, and then populations tend to level out at the carrying capacity or greatly overshoot it and die back. So in the dashed line, it's greatly overshooting the carrying capacity, dies back to the carrying capacity. And then since it's below the carrying capacity, it has more capacity to increase. The solid line shows a more gradual change, slight overshoot of the carrying capacity, slight decline back, slight overshoot, etc., small oscillations around the carrying capacity. In general, we identify 2 life history strategies. Now, this is not a strategy in terms of the animals are thinking about this. It's an evolutionary strategy whereby evolution favors the persistence and survival of organisms that carry certain types of traits. So our selected individuals would have large numbers of offspring, very small offspring, like the small seeds on a dandelion or the small babies that are produced by crickets. But the cricket produce hundreds of them, and there's hundreds and hundreds of dandelion seeds. In contrast, K-selected species have fewer offspring, and they invest more energy in each one. Now, this could be bigger egg size, bigger seed size, or it could be parental care, such as we see in the common loon. Both parents' care is necessary to take care of the loon chicks, and they can only produce a few of them, but if they do so, they can have a good odds of survival. Likewise, a coconut, for a plant, it's a fairly large seed, as opposed to something like a maple tree or a tulip poplar, very, very small seeds, but hundreds of them or thousands of them. Coconut might have a dozen or two. And so each coconut seedling then has a good odds of survival because it has a relatively large seed, a lot of calories invested into that by the parent tree. So in general, the R-selected species tend to exhibit what we call exponential growth. This is a J-shaped population curve. If you use your imagination in the blue line, you see it kind of looks like the letter J. It increases more steeply over time and can exceed the carrying capacity. In contrast, logistic growth is what we call K-selected growth, K-selected species, or we call it an S-shaped population curve. So if you tip your head a little bit to the right, you can see that it forms, the red line forms the letter S, where it increases more slowly, and then after it reaches half the carrying capacity, it starts to kind of level off slowly, and then ends up right at the carrying capacity. We're going to skip the interactive examples in the Mastering Biology homework. That's for another class. And the BioFlix tutorial. All right, so now different types of things. What type of growth curve is this? You would be right if you said this is a logistic growth curve or S-shaped population curve. Exponential growth that then slows down, levels off at the carrying capacity. For this paramecium population, this is a protozoan that lives in the lab. So it's logistic growth, K-selected, and we also call it an S-shaped population curve. Domestic sheep on Tasmania. What type of growth curve is this? Well, it's a little bit exponential early on. In the 20s, you can see it's kind of slow growth, but then it increases, goes over 2 million sheep, and then it dies back. So there's some oscillation around the carrying capacity, but then once you reach that level, it's pretty straight. It's mostly K, but initially there's a little bit of that exponential growth curve. All right, Daphnia population in the lab, and this line is hand drawn in by me. You can see dramatic capacity for exponential growth curve. Each female can produce 12 to 15 offspring, which are all genetic clones of herself. So it can overshoot the carrying capacity greatly, but then from there, it's a big oscillation at the start, and then the fluctuations get smaller and smaller. They produce fewer offspring if they have exceeded the carrying capacity, and so there's more modest fluctuation. So we call it damped oscillation, big oscillation at the start, smaller ones later, or it's overshoot and die back. Now what about our song sparrow? This is kind of a cyclical population. There's no real carrying capacity. Maybe 60 females would be the population's carrying capacity, or 50, but once it reaches that point, it has the capacity for dramatic declines, dramatic increases, lots and lots of exponential growth to recover from population crashes. And this is normal for this species. Snowshoe hare and a lynx. A lynx is like a large bobcat that's really snow adapted. They prey on a variety of different species that are there in the Canadian woods, including the snowshoe hare, which is really adapted to surviving in the snow, camouflaging itself. It grows white hair during the wintertime. You'll notice for this, there's a predator-prey oscillation. So the predator and prey cycle in really similar cycles to each other, maybe 6 to 8 year cycles. But usually the snowshoe hare peaks first. So the predator is not abundant. That allows the prey species, the hare, to take off and greatly increase its population size. Then that's lots of food for the lynx. So it has a lot of babies. There's good survival of those babies, and then that causes predation on the snowshoe hare, which then causes that population to crash, and then a year or two later, then the lynx population crashes. So you see a lot of these cycles. Just before the 1900s, there was a cycling where the hare increased around 1920, 1925. You can see there's several good years of snowshoe hare before the lynx recovered and increased. And please note the different scales. There's a lot more hares here than lynx within this area, but it's kind of indicative of the predators within the system. For other cases, there's a lot of things going on. This is a moose population on Isle Royale in Lake Superior. It's a big island off the coast of Michigan, really, I think, part of Michigan, and it's set aside as a national park. You can see exponential increase between 1960 and 1970, where the number of moose goes up over time, and the relative rate of that increase gets larger because the population is growing. But then there's wolf predation that caused a steady decline in the late 70s, early 80s. Then there's an increase in the moose population. And then around, let's say, 1995 or so, 1996, there was a dramatic collapse caused by food shortage, severe winter weather, and ultimately 75% of the moose starved within that area. Now, that would sound like it's bad, and it is for the population, but what happened the next few years? The population increases back up because biotic potential, it has the capacity to increase the population. The human population, likewise, this would be a J-shaped population curve or exponential increase. We're currently undergoing a pretty dramatic increase. Now we're over 8 billion people. So where are we going to level off? Are we going to experience population declines? All of these are unanswered questions. But this would be exponential growth or a J-shaped population curve. And let me mention, during the plague, there was a dramatic die-off because of the bubonic plague, which ravaged Europe and other places. A third of the people in Europe died as a result of the plague. But a few years after it, the population popped right back up. So we have the capacity to replace our population and increase it. Finally, survivorship curves. This looks at survival of a population, or males or females in this case. We're going to start with 1,000 individuals, and note it's on a logarithmic scale, 1,000, 100, 10, 1. You can see from this graph that females live longer than males, and they have better survivorship. So males only live 4 or 5 years. Females can live 6, 8, 9 years, and there's a more gradual decline for females. What it takes to make this happen would be actual data collection out in the field. This was a study by Peter and Rosemary Grant on Daphne Island in the Galapagos Islands. They went out to this area and misnetted the birds. This is the medium ground finch. They did a landmark study of evolution there, and in the process collected a lot of good population ecology data. So they went out in 1978, captured about 250, 275 of the medium ground finches, all the ones that have been born that year, and then they put tags on their legs, and they could follow them throughout the rest of their lifespan, which is 14 or 15 years. And then they could track them and see how many survived and what percent lived, what percent died. You'll notice that there are certain years that are really good years, like 1, 2, 3, and 4, probably because of lots of rain that then led to an abundant amount of seeds and food for them to eat. And then there are other years where they had high mortality, 50% or more mortality, or 40% or more mortality, such as year 0, 5, 6, and 7, year 11, and then that caused a dramatic decline in the population at that point. So it involves getting out there, a lot of effort to collect the data that we see here. And to finish this up, there's basically 3 types of survivorship curves: type 1, type 2, and type 3. Humans, type 1, most humans tend to live a great percentage of the maximum lifespan. And then the mortality rate increases once you're beyond 50% of the maximum lifespan. In contrast, the type 2 curve, squirrels, tend to have a consistent proportion that die each year, maybe 25% of the population or 40% of the population, regardless of where they are in the lifespan until they reach the maximum lifespan. And then oysters would have a type 3 survivorship curve. Lots and lots of mortality of the babies. They'll produce thousands and thousands of eggs that hatch and live in the plankton, filter feeding there. Most of them die. 90+% of them die. Then some will settle out, and then they make small oysters, which still have high mortality rate, not as much as the plankton. And then once they reach maybe 2 inches long, really, really good survival. And from there, they'll make it the rest of their lifespan because they're in a nice, durable shell and they have good survivorship. And then somewhere in adulthood, they will then reproduce and produce thousands and thousands of offspring.